מעולה. אז ערב טוב לכולם. נפגשנו כבר יחסית הרבה זמן, כבר התרגלנו לפעם בשבוע, עברו כמה שבועות. דאטה פלטפורם מיטאפ, יש לנו האמת, בטח ראיתם בקרוב, יש לא מעט מפגשים כמעט כל שבוע. קצת הודעות ועדכונים ונעבור להרצאה. מעניין לראות כמות המשתתפים. חלק אומרים לי למה בשעה כזאת, למה בערב, חלק אומרים למה בבוקר, למה בצהריים, אז אני מנסה לשחק עם זה לגוון, כי לכל אחד מתאים משהו אחר. וזה מעניין לראות שהמפגש הקודם שלנו, למי שזוכר, למי שהיה, היה על מונגו-דיבי, לפני כמה שבועות, זה היה באותה שעה, גם כן ב9 בערב, היו מלא אנשים, היה מפוצץ, עכשיו אני רואה בינתיים יש 15, זה עולה לאט לאט, כנראה יהיה הרבה פחות, אז בסופו של דבר זה כנראה, מה שקובע זה התוכן, הרבה יותר מכל דבר אחר. כשיש תוכן מעניין אז מגיעים, לא משנה באיזה שעה. חוץ מזה גם יש לנו אילוצים לפעמים של מרצים מחו"ל, כמו היום, אז אנחנו צריכים להתאים את עצמנו לשון ארצות הברית, אז זה גם חלק מהסיפור. קצת עדכונים, אז כרגיל, אם יש כאלה שבכל זאת חדשים פה ולא מכירים, אז אנחנו נמצאים במיטאפ, יש פה את הלינק לאתר של הקבוצה, יש גם את ה-QR קוד אם אתם רוצים לצלם. אני מניח שאם אתם פה אז כנראה הגעתם דרך שם, אז אתם רשומים כבר, אם לא אז תירשמו. יש לנו קבוצה מאוד פעילה בפייסבוק, דאטה פלטפורם, כל מה שקורה בקהילה, דיונים מקצועיים, מחפשי עבודה וכו'. ערוץ היוטיוב שלנו, כל ההקלטות, כל הארכיון של כל ההרצאות, אנחנו עכשיו עושים שם קצת סדר, אז יכול להיות שחלק מהדברים אולי זמנית לא יופיעו, אז אני מתנצל עם זה, אבל בקרוב יהיה שם כל ההיסטוריה, ואנחנו ממשיכים להקליט ולהעלות לשם החומרים. תעשו סאבסקרייב, אז תקבלו כמובן עדכונים על כל דבר חדש שקורה שם. עוד כמה ערוצים בקהילה, אחד זה רדיו SQL Server, פודקאסט, שאני ואיתן בלומין משחררים פעם בחודש, יש גם בעברית, גם באנגלית. אם אתם בעניין של SQL Server, אז מוזמנים לעשות סאבסקרייב ולהאזין לתוכניות, משהו כמו חצי שעה, כל תוכנית, משהו כזה. כל מה שקשור ל-SQL Server. מדברים על המון דברים בהקשר הזה. יש לנו קבוצת וואטסאפ מאוד פעילה, זה נקרא מומחים של מדרה, אז גם הצוות שלנו שם, אבל גם המון אנשים מהקהילה, יש 250 אנשים, קבוצה מאוד פעילה, המון דיונים מקצועיים, כדאי להיות שם, אם יש לכם שאלה מקצועית שקשורה לדעת פלטפורם של מייקרוסופט, אתם יכולים לשאול אותה שם, ויש מספיק אנשים שיענו לכם, אפשר ללמוד הרבה אחד מהשני. יש לנו רפוזיטורי בגיטהאב, שנקרא מדרה טולבוקס, אנחנו מעלים לשם המון סקריפטים, פרויקטים, פתרונות שאנחנו מפתחים, זה עולה לשם כאופן סורס, מוזמנים להירשם לשם, להוריד, להשתמש, לתרום, לקחת חלק, יש שם המון דברים שם כבר ספרייה מאוד עשירה, של סקריפטים כאלה ואחרים, אז מומלץ להסתכל מה יש שם. זהו, זה מבחינת ככה ערוצים וכולי, קצת אירועים, אז קודם כל הזכרתי את האירוע הקודם שהיה מונגו-דיבי, מי שפספס ורוצה, תיכנסו לדף של האירוע, זה הלינק שיש פה, או ה-QR קוד, יש שם הלינק להקלטה ביוטיוב של האירוע הזה, אז מוזמנים לצפות בהרצאה, היה מאוד מעניין. מה מצפה לנו בקרוב? אז כמה דברים. בשבוע הבא זה יוצא, נכון? כן, שבוע הבא ב-14 לפברואר, לא זוכר איזה יום זה יוצא, יום ראשון, כן, יום ראשון, ב-11 בבוקר, שלא תגידו שאנחנו רק בערב, אנחנו מגוונים. ב-11 בבוקר הרצאה על Power BI Embedded של טל רוסטוקר ממייקרוסופט, הרצאה מאוד מעניינת, שכבר ראיתי אותה בפורום אחר. מומלץ, כל מי שמתעסק עם Power BI ומעניין אותו הנושא של Embedded, אז תגיעו להרצאה ביום ראשון. במסגרת הריאקטור של מייקרוסופט, יש קמפיין, בטח חלקכם מכירים לפחות, שנקרא Azure is coming. אנחנו בעצם עוברים על המייקרוסופט Learn, על כל ה-Learning Pass, כל המסלולי למידה, לפחות הפונדמנטלס הבסיסיים של Azure במייקרוסופט Learn, ובעצם אנחנו עושים מפגשים אחת לשבוע, בימי רביעי בשעה 4 אחרי צהריים, כמובן אונליין, הכל אונליין, כמו שאתם יודעים, כל פעם מודול אחר, כל פעם יש מומחה אחר, מישהו אחר שמעביר את אותו מודול, ולומדים אותו ביחד בעצם, יש המון אנשים שכבר הצטרפו ולוקחים חלק בסיפור הזה, ועושים אחר כך את ההסמכות, אז כבר בעצם את כל החלק של Azure Fundamentals, את הבסיס, כבר כיסינו למעשה. אני גם לאחרונה התחלתי ככה לעשות את כל ההסמכות, שהיא לי את הכל מסודר, אז עשיתי את ההסמכה של Azure Fundamentals לפני שבוע, ואני מתחיל עכשיו לפי הסדר לעבור על כולם. ב-17 לפברואר, שזה יום רביעי בעוד שבועיים, נכון? אם אני לא טועה, איפה אנחנו היום? לא, שבוע הבא, סליחה, רביעי הבא. אני מתחיל להעביר יחד עם איתי בנימין, סדרה של סשנים במסגרת הפרויקט הזה, על Azure Data Fundamentals. כל ה-Data Services ב-Azure עושים סקירה, גם על ה-Relational, Non-Relational וגם Data Analytics, עוברים על כל הדברים האלה, שהמטרה היא שבסוף זה 7 סשנים כאלה, במהלך 7 שבועות, המטרה היא שבסוף התהליך הזה בעצם, קיבלתם את כל הידע, אתם יכולים ללכת לעשות את המבחן ולקבל את ההסמכה של Azure Data Fundamentals, גם אני אעשה את זה יחד איתכם, אז מוזמנים להצטרף, זה מתחיל ב-17 לפברואר, כמו שאמרתי, כל יום רביעי בשעה 4, הכל גם מוקלט, אז גם אפשר אחרי זה לגשת לזה וכולי, זה מתחיל שבוע הבא. מה עוד? במסגרת הדאטה פלטפורם מיטאפ שלנו, בשבוע אחרי, ב-21 בפברואר, גם כן יום ראשון, ב-10 בבוקר, אנחנו עושים אירוע שהוא קצת שונה. עשינו איזשהו סקר, שאלנו אתכם, את הקהל, אם זה מעניין, קיבלנו תגובות מאוד חיוביות, המטרה היא לעשות סקר במתכונת של Ask me anything, או Ask us anything, ויהיו שם באמת, קודם כל צוות המומחים שלנו ממדרה, אבל כמה שיותר אנשים אני מקווה יבואו לשם, מומחים ממקומות שונים, כל אחד עם הידע שלו, ועשינו איזשהו סקר מה הכי מעניין אנשים, והנושא שהכי עלה זה Database Performance, Tuning and Optimization, והמטרה היא לעשות בעצם סשן פתוח לגמרי, לא איזושהי הרצאה פרונטלית רגילה כמו הפורמט הקבוע, אלא מעין פאנל מומחים, דיון מקצועי, תקראו לזה איך שאתם רוצים, שכל אחד יכול לבוא ולשאול שאלות, ומקווה שיש מספיק אנשים שידעו לנו תשובות ונייצר דיון ונלמד אחד מהשני. אז אנחנו מנסים פורמט חדש, לדעתי זה יהיה מאוד מעניין, קצת גיוון גם כן לא יזיק לנו, ואם זה יהיה מוצלח, אז בשמחה נעשה עוד כאלה בנושאים שונים, נשמח לקבל גם פידבק ורעיונות שלכם בהקשר הזה, אז זה איזשהו פיילוט, איזשהו ניסיון, זה יקרה ב-21 בפברואר, בשעה 10 בבוקר, תירשמו ותגיעו, שיהיה לנו מעניין ביחד. זהו, ועכשיו נראה לי שאני אעבור יש למישהו הערות, שאלות, משהו? לפני שאני עובר למט? כולם נורא שקטים. סבבה, מעולה. So Matt, I think it's time to introduce you.
Okay.
Okay, so Matt Gordon is here with us, a data platform MVP, a community leader, proficient with a lot of stuff around the Microsoft data platform, and specifically with cognitive services, which is the subject for today. I know Matt from conferences around the world, back at the times when we used to travel. So I met him in a few occasions, and I'm happy to have you here today. So Matt, I think it's time for you to share your screen.
All right.
Let's begin. I will monitor the chat, so if there are any questions, you want me to interrupt you or wait till the end? What do you prefer?
Interrupt is good. I usually take a couple breaks and ask. It is not actually, okay. Now it's going to let me share my screen.
All right.
So hopefully that's not what you're supposed to see. This is what you're supposed to see. Let me know if my slideshow comes up okay.
Yeah, great.
Okay. All right, and this will run probably about an hour. I'm not sure how long. I think the calendar invites 2 to 3:30 my time. So we'll go about an hour. So yeah, I'll take question breaks, but if there's some that you think I just jump in, that's totally fine.
Okay, cool.
All right. Well, hopefully the slides will advance, but here we go. Hey, they did. Okay, so this is me. I'm SQL at Speed everywhere online. Happy to take questions here. One thing there's a lot of stuff I miss about in-person events, but one of them is just the interactivity. It's a little bit harder in this venue, but feel free to just kind of throw things out. If you want to reach out after the fact, here are all the ways to find me. There's my email, Twitter, blog is sqlatspeed.com. You can find me on LinkedIn and reach out there as well if you want. A little bit more about me, and what I want to do is just draw your attention to the last line here. So as most of us know, PASS in its original form has ceased to be, but I'm happy to see meetups like this one ongoing. I know we're about to reboot ours here. Stay involved with things like this. I've always said, the worst case is you're going to attend one of these meetings, whether it's in person or online, and learn something you didn't know. The best case is you're going to connect with someone who's going to be a friend who might help you get a new job. You might help them get a new job. Who knows? But even though our events look different right now, staying involved with these and offering to volunteer, whether it's speaking, organizing, finding sponsors, whatever, I'm happy to be here. I'm happy you're here, and stay plugged in with this wherever you are dialed in from. So as that notes, I am from Lexington, Kentucky. In case you didn't know, that's me. So we're in red there. We are about to get hit with about a half an inch of ice. So it should be an entertaining 48 hours here. Not looking forward to that part, but it's still decent outside right now.
Good luck with that.
As I mentioned, yeah, the forecast keeps getting worse. Usually here they're like, it's going to be a bunch of winter weather, and then it doesn't show up. This is trending the other way, so we're definitely not looking forward to the next 2 or 3 days here. So I'm SQL at speed everywhere online. I remind you that again because I do want you to reach out if you want to do that. It's also a great excuse to show this slide. So occasionally I get to go car racing. 2020 was a little limited in that. Did get to do it a couple times, but if data and AI is not your thing, but you like racing, I'm always happy to chat about that. It's about the only thing I like to talk about more than this stuff. So let's dive into it. And I'll kind of set the stage with how I got into it. So my background is really as a DBA. Started as app dev, worked my way into database dev, worked my way into DBA roles, consultant, architect, all those kind of things. None of that really screams cognitive services to anybody. And I got involved in this stuff really for a very silly reason. So there was a podcast here in the States on soccer. I know we're like the only ones that call it that. And they were joking one year about how a team in England had basically ruined the top flight season there, had won the first 12 matches. The results on the field didn't matter. They jokingly said they were going to shut the podcast down unless somebody could give them a table that ranked the feelings of the supporters instead of the results on the pitch. I had happened to just read a blog by somebody that I used to work with on cognitive services stuff, and that's what launched me into this world. So I say that maybe you think it's a cool story, maybe you don't, but we're all data professionals, and it's good to kind of keep your eyes and ears open on what's around and what colleagues and friends and things like that might have gotten into in their roles. That's how I learned about this. It's opened some amazing doors for me in terms of learning cool stuff, getting to talk to a wide variety of groups that may not want to hear a DBA focused talk. So, stay plugged into what your friends are into, because you might kind of trip into something cool like this. So we're going to talk about what Azure Cognitive Services is, in case you've come to this and don't know. They market it more broadly under the label of Microsoft AI, but cognitive services, kind of outside the technical realm, is not really one of the marketing terms for it at all. And then we're going to spend most of our time in the language API itself. So I'll go over here in a slide or two what the 5 APIs are. And but we're going to spend most of the time in language, because I've found I've done some things with speech and vision and some of the other ones. I found language not only really interesting, but also very helpful. Once you can get all this stuff working, you understand the way the API is, how you can talk to them from a variety of things and all that. And it really kind of opens you up to, if language isn't really your interest, but it's speech or it's vision or something like that, you can take all the fundamentals you've learned here and apply those there. So we'll do probably 4 demos. If we have time, maybe a 5th. If not, I'll just reference it, and I could kind of send out slides of what I would have shown. That one often ends up cut. And then we're going to wrap up with some professional applications for this. So, my hope is that something you hear in this next bit of time sounds cool, and you want to take it from here and go play with it, maybe just for fun. But if you can apply it at work and kind of expand your skill set there and show you can bring value maybe in some different areas, that might help too. I can think of a couple people that have heard variations on this session over the years that it was really awesome to hear from, that they had actually moved on to different job roles as a result of something they started playing with from this talk. So I really enjoy giving this and kind of opening the AI world to data folks like me. So what is this stuff? Basically, it's a set of APIs, and you're going to see across these next few slides, anything in quotes is directly from the Microsoft page. So it's going to sound marketing speaky. It is marketing speak, but I like the way they've described a couple things. And I want to highlight a couple of them kind of so you can see intentionally how broad they are. So Microsoft says they're sets of ML algorithms to solve problems in the field of AI. That's incredibly vague, right? Yes, intentionally. So I started working with these in October of 2017. So a lot of this stuff was fairly new, was not even GA in some cases, and the description was the same then. And what's been interesting to see is how it's evolved. It's gotten more powerful. It can do so much more. They're going to leave this vague for a long time because the innovation in this space, rapid doesn't even cover how fast it goes. They change stuff here all the time. They improve things all the time. They add things all the time. So I do think it's interesting that even though it does probably 100 times more things than it did, the first line of the website is pretty much the same thing. So that's their term for it. What's a layman's term? It's code you can call with code you've written or bots. And so what I'm going to show you is in this kind of next part here where I ask, how do I use them? If you want to write code, if you're an app dev and you're comfortable in that world and you know C# or you know Python, cool. The demo right at the end is going to be code heavy. I'm going to show you a C# app that translates some phrases. That's great if that's what you want to do. If code is scary or you're like me and you're just kind of lazy, you don't want to sit down and write a bunch of code. You just kind of want to drag and drop some stuff and maybe type a bit. I'm going to show you some ways to utilize these things via that method too. So there's something here for everybody. If you just want to log on and play, we can do that. If you want to write a bunch of code and make the calls yourself and deserialize JSON and all that, we can do that too. And so you're going to see all that across the next hour here. So how do you learn to call them? So I'm going to show you some examples of what I've done and some examples of what Microsoft kind of directs you through. That they have a lot of quick start things on the pages for this. But one thing I will say, the documentation around this is fantastic. So I've linked to it here. I have a resources slide at the end that also has some links on it for some of the things I'll show too. The documentation is really, really, really well done. For every call you can make, you're going to be able to find parameter list, parameter descriptions for pretty much everything, oftentimes an example, oftentimes in more than one language as well. So if you're C# or you're Python or Java or whatever, there's probably going to be examples for you there. When you get stuck on this, go to the docs. That's what I've always done. Any of the demos that I built, that's where I started. That's where I went every time I was stuck on something that wasn't working right. It's a great resource. They've done a really fantastic job. Not all of my presentations have wonderful things to say about everything Microsoft does, but this one certainly does. So what are these? What's the list here? So the list, currently there are 5. And so there's vision, and you may have seen some demos around this. Facial recognition was kind of the interesting one early on for ethical reasons and other reasons. They've kind of moved away from that. You don't see that being shown off much anymore. But what it does is it analyzes images and videos. You've probably seen one where it'll have a picture of a person and they're smiling, and it'll try to analyze their sentiment, much like one of the demos we're going to talk about later on the language side of the house. It'll say this is a smiling person. It'll put a score by their happiness, something like that. So it does that and much, 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 much more. There are good community resources out there, good sessions on that as well. So if you're interested in that, dive into the docs and search. I think Redgate is soon to put the past archives back up. I know there were vision sessions at least the last 2 past summits. So when Redgate puts those archives back up, go and check those sessions out. Vision's pretty cool. Speech, kind of exactly what it sounds like. The fascinating bit that it can do. So it does speech to text, text to speech, the things you would expect, speaker identification, but it can also do translation. So later at the end, I'm going to show translation from the language point of view. And unfortunately, speech in this venue doesn't come across very well, so I don't show it. But if you see the way I've put the language translation app together, you're going to understand how to call the speech API and do the same thing. And it's really powerful. It's awesome to play with. I can't wait for many reasons for us to be able to go back in person, because I've got some things I can show there when there's a room full of people that are kind of mind blowing. But for now, you'll have to settle for me describing that those things can happen. Language is where we're going to spend most of our time. It really undersells it to say that you use it to understand sentences, language, intents, things like that. But at a 50,000 foot level, that's what it does. Decision has been rebranded a couple times, hopefully not in the last day or two. Otherwise, I'll need to change this slide again. It's more than this, but the primary use cases I've heard for it is searching for academic research papers and things like that. It does help there. And then there's the web search API, which I think is now just called search. And it applies some machine learning algorithms to web searches, Azure searches, things like that. But we're going to focus on language from here on out. But I want you to know kind of what's in the whole suite. The key is, and you're going to hear me say this a few times, some of these APIs can be combined with each other. And I like to focus on language for two reasons. A lot of times, especially in our world, especially right now, a lot of times communication starts from speech or text, right? And like I said, the language API, I think it does the best job, even though it's not intended to do this, of understanding all the fundamentals of how this stuff is put together and the different ways to talk to it. So, and it translates well online as well. You don't need to, I don't have to have a speaker here, and you don't need to, hear things. We can see things. I will refer to this a few more times, but I do want to highlight it on this slide before we move on. Almost all of the ways that these APIs talk back and forth to whatever you're using to call it is JSON documents, tiny little files. And you'll see, so I'll kind of walk us progressively through, no code all the way to full code. And at the end, if you're really curious how the JSON is put together, I can show you that. And if not, we don't have to look at that. Any questions about the introductory part there? Okay.
Probably not.
Okay.
Leo said that cognitive services are the best.
They're so cool. Yeah, and hopefully after the next 40 or so minutes, everybody thinks so. So what does Microsoft say the language API is, and what does it do? Again, marketing speak here. It increases your application. That could be a website, could be just about anything, but it increases its ability to read, comprehend, and enrich written text. So what do I say? This is capable of more than just user and customer interaction for sure. But at least the way my brain works, a lot of kind of the case studies and use cases that came up, and as I've given talks on different parts of the suite over the years, a lot of what it comes down to is we want people to have a better experience on our website or in our app, or a more accessible experience. Maybe somebody's coming and the accessibility features of your app or your site aren't very good. This can help there, and we're actually going to start talking about something like that first. And going back to a few slides ago, is it just one API? Definitely not. But that kind of gets used interchangeably, both in my session and in the Docx as well. There's a number of different calls you can make here. And yeah, so what can we do with it? So you've heard me say it's cool. You heard me say we're going to do some translation, and that's about it though, right? So what can you do with it? So on the last slide, you heard me mention that the language API cannot just be used to mine the sentiment of somebody's social media posts or translate text or feed a chat with a bot or something like that. You can actually make somebody's experience in your site, your app, whatever, better. So how do we do that? And it's with the first item on this list. So what Immersive Reader does, and this I believe is the last bit of marketing speak, but I really like the way they phrased it. So it doesn't just help your mind may go to, well, this helps kids learn to read or something like that. It's much, much more than that. So it helps people who are just learning to read, people who are just learning a language, and people with learning differences as well absorb the written content on your site or in your app. And that's one of the many reasons I'm so thankful to kind of be a part of this world and get to speak at meetups and events and things like that, is hearing other speakers talk about the accessibility challenges. So, a layer up from the data that most of us probably work with, but really important. If somebody comes to your site for help or to buy something or whatever, and the experience is negative, or they simply can't experience, you haven't put thought into that, that can be a real problem. And so this is something you can use. There's a demo on Microsoft's site. It's difficult to kind of demo it myself, but they do a nice job where you can kind of play with everything I talk about here and more. But here's some of the highlights, and here's some of how it can help people interact with your site or your app. So it can change the viewable size of text if somebody has challenges with their vision. It can display tooltip pictures of commonly used words. So, that can be helpful for people learning to read, people learning the language, if they can associate it with a picture or something like that, that always helps. A little bit deeper into that language learning experience, and maybe not so much a customer facing thing, but certainly on the learning side of this. It can highlight nouns and verbs, and you can use it to diagram a sentence and explain to people what the different elements are and all of that. It can read the content out loud. So this is another area. So we're in Language API. Immersive Reader, if you go to the site, is considered to be a part of that. It's using the Speech API to read. And like I said, you're going to see that over and over again, where these are not siloed off. They can talk to each other pretty easily. It can display the syllables of words as well. So if you're trying to work on pronouncing things better, it can handle all that. And then it uses the Translator API as well to translate the content back and forth from one language to another, so on and so forth. So again, I have a link on the resources slide at the end to the Microsoft site, where basically it takes you to a demo site and you can type in whatever text you want, and you can turn all of this on or off and kind of play with it. So if this has piqued your interest, or you work in schools, or anything that's teaching people language reading, this may help. It's very cool. And I know, even though it's a marketing tagline, Microsoft leans on that kind of hashtag AI for good. This is certainly an example of that, where we're going to talk a lot in the rest of this how you can use this to kind of sell people stuff. This is you could use it that way, but this is really geared to be more helpful. So very cool stuff here. Kind of a nice positive way to start out. Any questions about that?
Yeah, there's a question whether the language API is based on the language understanding, the LEYS, or the opposite.
Yeah, so now that we've covered kind of the happy, positive stuff, we'll get into the stuff we can use to analyze people's text and maybe get them to buy stuff. So Luis is actually the next thing that I'm going to show, and then we'll do Q&A Maker, Text Analytics, and Translator Text last. So this and the Language API for me have a weird relationship. So if you go to the documentation, it'll say that this is a component of it. It's under that umbrella. I kind of agree less and less the way that it matures. So I do understand why they have it framed like that, and it does use a lot of the algorithms we're using for this other stuff. But increasingly, I kind of see this as its own thing. But it does, for now, still, I think, fall nicely here. So what can it do? And I'll say this first. My friend Sam Nasr, he's on Twitter, SAMNASR. He lives in Ohio, so one state north of me, gives a session just on this. Luis is very cool, and it deserves its own session. I kind of want you to be exposed to it here. By no means can I cover in just a few minutes everything it does. But I know Sam's given, I believe it's been recorded a couple times. If you're not able to find it, reach out to me and I'll help track it down for you. But if this is your interest, I'm just going to skim the very surface of what it can do. So what are the basics of what it can do? It determines the intent of a statement. So it's intended to lay the framework for kind of a conversational experience, whether that's a chatbot or whatever kind of wrapper you want to have it in. So it determines the intent of what you're saying. Are you asking for something? It then attempts to isolate the entities in there and kind of use that, and this is layman's terms that I'm using here, but frame that context to understand what you're after. You know, are you asking about a certain thing? Are you asking for a certain thing? As all the rest of this does, there are JSON objects that fly back and forth as this talks to whatever's calling it. The main use case I see is, you know, if you go to a website and there's the very perky person that pops up in the bottom, even if it's like 3 a.m. and says, "Can I help you?" Odds are they're not there, and odds are what's underneath them is this or something like this. So you do get a natural conversational experience to a certain extent from this. The cool thing is you don't have to, depending on what your use is, you don't have to build something from scratch to use this. There are pre-built models. We can briefly go over what those are. You can also create custom models as well. And so if the pre-builts don't cover it, or you just kind of want to dive in and get your hands dirty, custom models are pretty straightforward to make. And you can build an app a couple of different ways. And so this is where we get in. Like I said, I'm lazy. I don't like to write any code that I don't have to. So I'm going to show you some of the experience through the portal, but you can call this through code as well. So on that note, let's switch over to the VM where I have this set up. Any questions before I show this?
Nope.
Okay. All right. So like I said, it isolates entities and intents and then would frame those as part of a conversation. So I used to demo the Book Me a Flight. We're really not supposed to be doing that right now. So I order pizza. We're doing a lot more of that these days than flying. And so how does this work? So a query comes in, and let's say this would come in through a site, through a bot on a site. And the query is order me 2 pizzas. So not really a question, but certainly a statement of intent, right? And so there are, and this is using one of the pre-built models, and I'll show you what those are here in a minute. What it does is it uses an algorithm to score, well, here are the intents I know about. Which one is this based on the language that has been given to me? So we've got food order, and it's, you know, fairly confident that it's that one, but you get scores for everything else. You know, is it none? Probably not. Is it location finder? Probably not. Is it reminder? Definitely probably not. And is it book flight? No, because nobody's doing that now. And then, so we've got that part. What's the intent? What does it want me to do? And then your bot would talk back. But what are the entities here as well? And so it parses that statement. It says the food type, which is classified pizzas, number 2. Pretty straightforward. So this is what the JSON looks like. So this is an utterance that would come at it, and this is what it returns. So let's have a little more insight into what these actually look like. So let me go ahead and sign in. Unfortunately, once you're signed in, you can't get back to that. So apologies for the few seconds of translation here, and I certainly don't want to do that. Well, fascinating. So 6 hours ago, this didn't do that. So what it is supposed to do, so you know what, let's flip back. So what it's supposed to do is it'll show you the pre-built models. I'll just kind of do these from memory here, and we'll switch back to the slides. Gotta love when stuff changes this fast, right? So let's see, what if we,
Yeah,
there
we
we
just
go.
talked about that.
Yeah. And I ran all this at 7:30 my time, so about 7 hours ago. So what the pre-built models are things like home automation, like smart home things. You would have smart assistant things: turn on my lights, lock my doors, turn on my ceiling fan. Those sorts of things. There's a pre-built model for restaurants taking reservations, food ordering, which is part of what the front page of the portal shows. And then you can create your own custom ones as well. And what's interesting, and unfortunately I can't get to it right now, because that's actually a process I already did at the end of last year. I'm not sure why the prompt is coming up right now. But what I was going to show you is I built a very basic model for another project I have in this space that hopefully will see the light of day one day. And I was showing off how the custom model would work. And what it was, and my family was really disappointed in this, is it was a bot you could talk to order a donut. Now, it's not wired to a donut shop, and that's where the family disappointment came in. We got no actual donuts when I made this run. But what was interesting to watch is how it would put together from a bare bones model. I gave it almost nothing to work with at all, and then would just test it and score it, where it would have 3 or 4 intents, 3 entities, I think, and it would quickly understand that it was to order donuts, not pizzas, not cars, not anything else. So I was hoping to show that to you. Azure has not allowed us to do that. But are there any other questions about this service? Because like I said, we've barely skimmed the surface here. It's really cool. And if you're interested, I hope you look up Sam's session on this. Okay, so I've gotten some feedback on this session here or there that I present these two in the wrong order, and I disagree, which is why I keep doing it like this. And to be fair, the majority of folks seem to like the way this is structured. If you have any feedback on this, it changes constantly. I'll have all my information up at the end again. Feel free to send that on, because I always want to make this better. This is a part of this where I'm a little bit stubborn about it. So Q&A Maker and Luis do similar things. Luis is definitely the more complicated and more nuanced version of that. So Q&A Maker can give you a conversational experience, and I'm actually going to show you how that works in the next demo. But it's not as smart as Luis can be, and that's why I like to kind of show that I have this bare bones model that there's almost nothing to it, but you have a much more intelligent conversation with it than a bot over the top of Q&A Maker. But where Q&A Maker is fantastic, especially for DBAs here, and I'll talk about at the end, one thing I think that's really cool for us to be able to do with this. Q&A Maker is simple to set up. Luis can be simple to kind of get going, but to really have a nice, rich experience, there's a fair amount of work. Q&A Maker, there's not. So it can serve information interactively. It drives off what Microsoft calls knowledge bases. Now, those knowledge bases can be just about anything. They can be HTML, they can be a Word document, they can be an Excel sheet, they can be a PDF, tab separated value file, so on and so forth. Bunch of options. And there's actually a portal that I'll show you where you can type in your own question and answer pairs. So you don't even have to have a source, you can just do it. But it's a fixed offering. You can customize the personality a bit, and we'll walk through that. But its flexibility comes from the information you feed it. You can't really tweak the implementation a lot. It kind of is what it is. What it is cool. So let's go to that demo, and we'll cross our fingers that it's in a better mood than the first one. Okay, so this is a knowledge base that I've had for a while, and the website here is this QAmaker.ai, where the Luis portal is luis.ai. And this is a knowledge base I made on the, let's say, on the possibility that maybe my wife wanted to give me a really nice gift, and she knows I like to drive cars fast. And so she's gone out on the internet somewhere to find a way to do that. And so what I did, so you see a knowledge base here, and it's fairly straightforward. We've got questions on the left, we've got answers on the right. If you want that conversational aspect, you can add follow-up prompts, and this is where the customization comes in. You could add alternative phrasing. So if you have analytics off your bot or something like that, that a question that you think was going to be answered one way, so you worded the question here that way, actually comes to you in a different turn of phrase. You can add alternative phrasing here. So maybe they ask one of 4 turns of phrase, they're always going to get this answer. So let's talk to it, and then I'll kind of show you how this was built. Okay, so what I want to know, or what my wife wants to know, because she's shopping to buy me a fabulously expensive gift, is she wants to know if I can bring friends. So we're going to ask it, can I bring guests? And this can take a few seconds. There we go. Usually once it gets going, but it doesn't always start like that. So can I bring guests? Yes, guests are free to join. Fantastic. But what if I didn't ask it that? What if I asked it, can I bring other people? And this is where the experience with Luis, in my mind, is superior to this. So I'm asking the same thing, right? It's a slightly different phrasing, but I'm asking it the same question. But because the word other was in another answer, the intelligence under this, such as it is, went and pulled this answer instead of what I was asking, which is really this thing. So again, it's easy to set up. When I built this original demo about a year ago. No joke, it took me 10 minutes roughly to get the basics going, including this bot. But then you can see kind of where it falls down a bit. So it's a great way to serve information. Can it hold a conversation or do a complicated set of things? Probably not as good as that. So let's go make one, and I'll kind of show you how this works. All right, so what we've got, so I've gone to create. I'm signed in. You would just use your Azure creds here. Obviously that I kind of show you the pre-baked version because some of this doesn't demo well at all. For instance, when you click on create a Q&A service, you need one. It takes 2 or 3 minutes to provision, and there's nothing to look at. So I'm not going to bore us with that. So I've gone ahead and done this, and then I need to connect it to my knowledge base. And so basically what that is once the service is created, you need to supply things like your Azure directory ID, the subscription name, the name of the service you gave it, and the language as well. And let's take a look at that. So it can talk back and forth, and unfortunately for this group, Hebrew is not one of those. When we get to translation, it does handle that. So the conversational element right now is limited to the 9 languages shown here. Extraction, so the kind of the basic like question and answer experience and extracting the information, much like Luis, where we talked about it, pulls that out. It's capable of that in a lot more languages. You can see I'm still scrolling here. Hebrew is one of them here. So you wouldn't get the full experience like I've just shown, but you can get some data extraction out of there. And then you could always pair this up with something along the lines of the Translator app I'm going to show and kind of extend the capabilities here. But out of the box, it's limited to these 9 for what I just showed. So you just give it a name. That's just for your reference. Like I said, it doesn't care. And then we're going to populate it here. So a couple of things I want to call your attention to. You can enable multi-turn extraction from URLs, PDFs, and Docx files. So that's a conversational element. So I've just said like it's not great at really holding an intelligent conversation. If you feed it multi-turns of question and answers that prompt each other, it will do it. But again, Q&A Maker is very much the information you give it. And so the multi-turn extraction is just from URLs, PDFs, and Docx files. So if you click here, it's going to go over that list that I just gave you. Like I said, tab separated values, Excel sheets, Word docs, all that. I populated it from a URL, which if you looked carefully at the top of my knowledge base, it says source HTTP Miami Exotic Auto Racing. I cannot vouch for them at all. I don't know if it's a reputable business at all, but it was a website that worked well for this and had cool cars on it. The interesting part is, since I built this, their website has actually been offline. So maybe they were not reputable. So due to thanks to the Wayback Machine, though, I've pulled it up. And so you'll see when I built this, I just pointed it at this part of their site here, the HTTPS Miami Exotic Auto Racing. And there's the question I asked it, right? Can I bring guests? So, and then you can kind of click through and see, and you can kind of see that the can I bring guests, if I worded it slightly differently, if I had said, can I bring guests in the car, I'm going to get this. I'm not going to get this answer. So I thought it was kind of a unique way to set up both how easy it is to get Q&A Maker going, but also the weaknesses in some of what it does. So I want to cover one more thing about Q&A Maker, and then we'll move on. So the chit chat. So, where I said this is kind of out of the box, it's just pretty limited in how you can customize it. This is the last area you can customize. So you can give it the ability to answer a bunch of small talk. And so if you want to say, hi, how are you? Tell me a joke, those sorts of things, you can enable that for this if you want, and you can give it a bit of a personality. You can also turn that off. And for mine, I have it turned off. But if this is going to be a customer facing bot, you may want to give it one of the personalities shown here. You can obviously click through that link to learn the details about what they do, and it's not offensive or anything like that. It just kind of depends on the experience you're after for your users. And then we would go down here, create, and a couple minutes later we'll have it. And then, like I said, you can go and create a web app bot to talk to it like we just did. And actually, if you click through channels, there's a link in here that gives you the iframe code to put this bot on your site. So my talents don't lie in web design at all, but I would be able to put this on a website with just an additional few minutes of work. So it really is, it's easy to stand one of these up with a knowledge base, kind of a bot front end, and then drop it on a site somewhere. And like I said, we'll go over some stuff at the end. I think some really interesting applications for DBAs and how they might be able to use this. Any questions about that?
I guess not.
Okay, so text analytics is probably kind of the heaviest part of this, in that it encompasses more than one thing. I'll go over kind of 4 highlights of what it does, and a lot of these borrow on each other. So feel free to stop me with questions, or if it's a little bit confusing or something like that, because as complimentary as I was to Microsoft earlier, some of the naming of some of these features I think is quite poor, and it's pretty confusing to read about. It's confusing to talk about. Hopefully I can kind of clear that up for you, but if not, let me know for sure. So key phrase extraction is something you've probably seen. And so if you go to a restaurant review site like Yelp, or kind of any travel site that's not associated necessarily with a brand, but they're showing you restaurant reviews or hotel reviews or Airbnb reviews or something like that, and you see at the top where it'll say, like, this restaurant, people who found it searched for pasta sauce and good wine, or whatever it may be. They're using key phrase extraction under the covers to extract those phrases out of the reviews that people leave. So when somebody goes into the app and says, I want a restaurant with good pasta sauce and good wine, it's using key phrase extraction, saying, well, there are 50 reviews on this site that have those phrases in it. So this is probably a restaurant this person might want. And like Yelp will call it out as a highlight too. So if you kind of look at that summary right at the top, that's what powers this. So text analytics, that's one of the things that it can do. It's not just helpful though with something like Yelp. So one use case I've seen and talked through with people and seen used is, let's say you support a product and your product, a new version of it comes out, and you have a knowledge base where users can go and talk about issues they have, support they might need, all those sorts of things. A really great way to stay on top of, whether it's software, hardware, or what, to stay on top of that early release and if people are happy or not, is to combine a couple of these things. So key phrase extraction, number one, if let's say it's extracting phrases with a lot of profanity or something like that, most likely people are quite upset. You'll want to know about that. On the flip side, if it's extracting phrases that's like wonderful version, great product, all that, you'll know that things have gone pretty well here. And you can pair this with sentiment analysis, which is what our next demo will be, to kind of get a more nuanced view of what that sentiment might be, because it does do well with detecting like sarcasm and things like that as well. So key phrase extraction is one of the things that it can do. The documentation does note, and I've certainly seen this to be the case, works a little better on unstructured text. I'm not a smart enough computer scientist to understand exactly why that is, but it works well on everything, but on unstructured text, just kind of pulling out that word cloud of stuff, it's a little more accurate on that. Language API, and this probably won't shock anybody to know, does language detection as well. And we'll show that at the end in our last demo. And it scores those very much like when we saw the Luis intents, and you kind of had that confidence score. That's basically how it works. And we can show that in my translation app as well. Named entity recognition. This, like I said, this is where Microsoft's not always the best at naming features. I think probably any of us that have worked on Microsoft data stuff through the years, the names change, they shift. Sometimes they're detailed, sometimes they're confusing. This is certainly one of those things. So named entity recognition, the feature, contains both entity linking, which the best way to describe it is, and then I'll say what the marketing people say, because I don't think it's a good way to describe it. I like my way better. Entity linking is like if you go to a site and you'll see that some of the words are hyperlinks to other things. It would say like buy a ticket or for more information about X, and then X is a hyperlink off to somewhere. Entity linking is that. So there's elements of the language API that you could point at your site or a document or something like that, and then link to basically a Wikipedia powered at the start knowledge base of here's information on this stuff that you've linked out to. Now, what the marketing folks say is that it identifies and disambiguates the identity of an entity found in text. That's a tongue twister a bit. But while the name isn't good, it's kind of interesting what it does. So it uses that context again, like everything else we've talked about. The context, in this case, not a statement, but a document that it's actually reading. So it knows if the document is referring to Venus, the planet, or Venus, the Roman goddess. And so it's going to understand it. And that's where the disambiguation comes in. And it's pretty adept at that. And like I said, what was interesting in kind of putting the research together for this session is that Wikipedia is actually the knowledge base for a lot of this stuff. That's what they've used to train and test those models, which is pretty cool. Named entity recognition is a little less exciting, but you'll see it probably on your smartphone and things like that, where if there's a sentence that will say, travel here from 4 to 6 p.m. or this was $5 or something like that, it will highlight and understand that that's currency, or it will give you a hyperlink to make an appointment or go to your banking app or something like that. So the combination of entity linking and named entity recognition do work together to kind of give a richer experience. Like I said, the naming around it and the marketing speak around it for me is not great. Any questions about that before we dive into the demo? Okay, let's trying to switch to my VM. Here we go. Okay, so what I'm going to show you is, so if you're not familiar with logic apps, even though this is a cognitive services session, we're most likely mostly data people here. So I'm going to give you a 60-second sales pitch on why Logic Apps are the coolest thing. So one of the most fun things I discovered when I started playing with this, I'd never heard of Azure Logic Apps before. Had no idea what they were. They are incredibly powerful. So I'm using them to do, maybe a very silly thing here. And I'm ingesting a tweet. I'm detecting the sentiment of the tweet, saving it off to a database somewhere. These connect, so they are basically event-driven workflow containers, and not containers in the Kubernetes sense, but containers in like the bowl sense. So it just contains a set of actions like you see here. And they're event-driven in that they start from a connector, so you connect them to something, and then you say when a thing and that something happens, do the rest of this stuff. So I've used the Twitter connector here. But what's fascinating about these is, and I actually saw a session on this, and I cannot recall the online conference it was. It might have been SQL Saturday Vienna in January, is somebody was using Logic Apps to do ETL type things. So maybe you think all the cognitive services stuff I've talked about is boring and silly. But when you heard that, you're like, oh, maybe I want to play with these things. I recommend it. They're so powerful. I think there's 300 first-party connectors now. They can connect to pretty much any social media, ServiceNow, all kinds of things to start workflows off and get things to automatically happen that you don't have to babysit, and you don't have to write any code. You don't have to write a watcher that says when this thing is called, do this other thing. It's all under here for you, and it's all really JSON under the covers here as well. Like if we go to code view and it behaves there, that's not too scary, right? But you don't have to do that. You can just come over here and drag and drop stuff. So what this does is when a new tweet is posted and you specify search text here. Interesting part about this, when I started working on these in the fall of 2017, hashtags, you see hashtag HiQ there. Hashtags were not supported in search text. They are now, which made the original thing I did for the podcast a bit more difficult than it would be these days. But so you put your search term here. You can also tag a handle. So let's say, for instance, you're working for a company and maybe there's a reviewer of your products or an angry customer or something like that, and you want to have some monitoring put around when they've put a tweet or a Facebook post or something like that, when they've done anything, because they seem to have it out for you. You can do that here. Or if you're monitoring tweets from a big brand or a country or something like that, you can do all of that here. Then you say, how often do you want to check? Which is, you can think of this like a file watcher, if you're familiar with that. So you can say every minute, check to see if there's been tweets about Docx, and it'll call the search API, and it will kick off one of these workflows you see here for every tweet that has dog in it. For the most part, the search API does gate you a bit, so you can't flood it with stuff. One thing I want to call out here, which I always thought was a bit of a funny story, is this lies. So it says, how often do you want to check for items? So you and I are going to look at this and say, well, every 1 minute, it's going to do that. Fantastic. Well, like I said, the first project I did with these, I was reviewing tweets with all 20 Premier League clubs in England. Any tweet they were tagged in, I was reviewing their sentiment, and it ended up getting me on the soccer podcast and all of that. But just think about, arguably the most popular league in the world for the world's most popular sport. There's a lot of tweets for 20 clubs on a match day. So because I was originally paying for it myself before we had sponsorship for it, in order to keep the cost down, I set this to 15 minutes. Match is 90 minutes, 15-minute halftime. I wanted 7 samples through the match. So I get all this started and it kicks off and I'm monitoring it and it's all running great. And the guys that do the podcast are really excited. And I get to the end of the day and I've got, tens of millions of tweets, and I've got scores and queries and graphs and all this stuff. And then I looked at the number of calls I had. So Cognitive Services and Logic Apps, they're consumption-based billing. So every time they do something, you're paying a little bit. I spent $750 running that for a day. I did not need sentiment analysis on my wife's face when I told her that. Now, the good thing is this story has a happy ending. So the way this works, even though the language seems clear here, and they've never changed the Docx, which I don't like. If the workflow never stops, the counter never restarts. So what was happening was during the course of a match, every time the API was called, like I said, there's tens of thousands of tweets about any club. So it's spinning up, kind of stateless things to execute a work stream of one of these tens of thousands of times. Those never went away. So it never checked, it never shut down so it could check again. So if you're monitoring a busy handle or a busy search term or something like that, keep that in mind. And the way you used to be able to handle that with Azure Scheduler. They deprecated that late in 2019. The way you would do that now is where you see this trigger, here's this. They want you to use a recurrence trigger in another logic app. That's a little outside the scope of this, but I'm happy to take questions about that online or offline. Basically, you build a killer logic app to shut this off on a time. And because they agreed the language was right and the documentation, or the language was wrong and the documentation was unclear, they refunded my money as well. So happy ending. Anyway, so what this does is this, like I said, pulls in search text. And then we've got the detect sentiment action, which is I provisioned a text analytics API in here, and that's, you just go to resources, you click the plus, you type text analytics, give it a name, region, all that. 5-10 minutes later, you have this. And the detect sentiment action gives you a score between 0 and 1. So 1 is the most positive, 0 is the most negative. You'll never see 1.000. You'll never see 0.000. You'll see generally returns between like 12 and 16 digits after the decimal. You can obviously round those. But yeah, it'll be, if it's 0.012, that's very negative. If it's 0.997, which is probably the highest I've seen, it's very positive. If it's 0.5, it couldn't score it. That's not well documented, but if you start playing with these, you're going to be confused like I was, and that just means it didn't know. It was an image and it didn't know how to score it, or it was maybe somebody's cat walked across their keyboard and hit send tweet, and it happened to have the search text in it, but sentiment analysis and no idea what to do with it. So it passes the text here, and then the way we get the tweet text is in here is you highlight that. So I did this by insert a new step. I add the detect sentiment action, and of course I'm wired up to Cognitive Services here. Then you get this dynamic content pull down. Now sometimes when I'm presenting, this doesn't render right. So if it looks a little buggy, it actually isn't, though it may look that way through here. This is everything that the Twitter connector returns to you. So the tweet text is what we're concerned about here. But if you want to build a table of this stuff like I did, you can have the description of the user, their name, their location, the username created at, also anything you can pull from the Twitter search API about a tweet, you'll have here. And then simply you go down to add a new step. And in this case, I wrote these off to an Azure SQL database. So you connect to that database, you see that's already done. Again, that would be very boring to kind of walk you through. Specify table name, and again, you get this dynamic content pop out here, and you pull in username, tweet text. And when I started this, I also had it running through a streaming Power BI data set as well. That's really cool. It's also kind of expensive, so you'll see that's not actually working. There's a good reason for that. I don't want my wife to fuss at me again. Any questions about that? And we'll flip back and kind of wrap things up here. Okay, so we're going to wrap up with translator text. So everything I've showed you, not too scary, right? Not much code in there. Some of these you barely have to type. But I want to end up with, for those that are sitting out there, say, I really want to see the way an API call looks like. I want to see code that makes this run. That's what I'm about to show you. So the translator API is what I've chosen to do that. So what can it do? Translate text, obviously. There are two flavors of that. So the more popular, the more common one, and they keep a documentation page updated on which languages are translated which way. So there's NMT, like you can see there. And so that is more precise, it's faster, and certainly the more modern way to do it. Its corresponding thing is SMT, which is statistical machine translation. That is older, it's less precise, it doesn't perform as well. But what I've noticed, and I don't know that this is true for every language, but it seems to me as a language is introduced to the Translator API, it comes in using SMT first, and then it switches to NMT at some point. And like I said, they keep a Docx page updated almost daily, I think, with which languages use which. At last count, they were up into the 60s in terms of languages you could translate to and from. It also transliterates text as well. So if you're going from a language with one alphabet to a language of another one, it can handle all of that. Now, because I did a console app, I don't have a great way to show that here. But know that it can happen, and I think that would probably be particularly interesting to this group because that might be a use case that you would need. It can detect language like we talked about earlier, and you can use it to look up word translations as well. Now, again, it's called Translator. It's under the language API. We are speaking strictly text here. Speech service has its own thing. Like I said, speech deserves its own session. We can be back in person, and I can have some speakers that you can hear and not worry about feedback and all that. I will have a session on it. But Translator is cool and pretty powerful. So let's flip over and let's take a look at that before we bring this home. All right, so what I've got here is, so there's the big, scary code we spent an hour trying to avoid. Let me show you how this runs. So we're going to do .NET Run here. And like I said, this is just a simple console app. My talents, I'm better at application development than web design, but not by much. So we'll say thank you for allowing me to present this session. And there we go. So I've got kind of the full output here. And as I was saying at the start, the last time I presented this was to SQL Day, which is based in Poland. So Polish is actually the first one there. So what we have here, it's translated to Polish, German, Italian, and Klingon. So if there are any Star Trek fans, believe it or not, Klingon is one of the languages it translates to. I am told that it is correct. I don't know that to be true, but I'm told by people that it is. So the reason I have kind of the full output showing here is I want to show you the JSON that comes back and then how it formats it. So before we get to that, we'll kind of work our way up. So we've got the 4 languages here. We have confidence score, which is, it is very confident that I gave it English to translate to. And it says that. So I've detected English here. And so that part comes back in kind of the first part of the JSON document. And then we've got an array here of the translations. And you can kind of see those here. Console, doesn't give you the greatest way to see it, but it gives you the text and it gives you what you're translating it to, and it gives you the output from that. So let's take a minute and look at how this is put together. So what I've done up above is I've provided this an API key and a URL. This particular VM seems to have a problem with its environment variables. So for security reasons, you would never want this stuff in the clear. And I'm not going to show it to you very long because I don't want you to hit mine. But generally, you would use an environment variable to store that. That just is this VM. It doesn't work, and I'm not sure why, or it doesn't always work. So what we've got here is, so I defined the URL up above. Then you've got a string, and this is where you define the languages here. So we're hitting translate. We're hitting API version 3 for now, and then simply 2 equals with the language code for each thing. So Polish, German, Italian, Klingon, supposedly. We've got some console output here, not that exciting. And then, we serialize it here, and then we send it. And so it's building the call down here. It's adding on endpoint, the route that we've defined above, the string content, which is the serialized JSON that goes up. As you can see here, it's pulling in our subscription key and our region as well. And then it sends an async call. It says, okay, here, send it back to me when you're done. It comes back. And right here is where it deserializes the kind of wall of JSON that we saw. It goes through the translation results, deserializes those, and then gives us here, which is basically nice kind of human readable output of what it does. This is in total, even with some of the supporting classes and all that, I think about 130, 102 lines of code. It's pretty simple. And so for somebody like me who says I'm lazy and code is scary and all that, this wasn't bad. And this is based off a Microsoft Quick Start on one of the documentation pages that they had up about 6 months ago. They update those pretty often, but this is simple. So let's, if it'll go back to my PowerPoint here. There we go. So let's wrap up and talk about what we can do with this. So we've already gone over some of this. I'll just kind of hit the highlights here because I know we're kind of on time. Immersive Reader, we talked about that, and there's a great tutorial and demo in their docs, which are linked in here if you want to go play with that. It incorporates a lot of what we talked about after this in terms of translation, and it can call the speech API and some of those sorts of things. Luis, we talked about. That's a conversational model. Unfortunately, didn't get to show you some of the custom models I built. We've talked how there's pre-built stuff for home automation, restaurants, check the weather, do web searches, those sorts of things. You can build it with or without code, so that portal experience I showed can be put together pretty fast, or you can build it with code and call it similar to what I just showed you there. Q&A Maker, and this is the part for DBAs. I think this is, especially if you work in a large environment or you're on a support desk or something like that, and you field a lot of questions like what customer does this server belong to, or what environment does this live in, or what data center is this box at, and you're tired of fielding that all the time. You could make a spreadsheet, feed it to a Q&A Maker knowledge base, and tell people to talk to a bot and ask the bot, and the bot will tell them. So that stuff where you get interrupted with a lot of basic questions about where things live and who they belong to and all that, you can automate all that here, and then they can search server names, environment names, customer names, what have you. So I think for the data pros, and especially the DBAs here, that's pretty cool. Text analytics, if you have any online presence at all, I actually had a whole session I used to give about this. Sentiment analysis, if your business or you yourself have any online presence at all, understanding the feeling about yourself or your company's brand or whatever can be very important. Companies that don't look at this often end up on the news having done pretty embarrassing things with their social media team. We also talked about how you can combine sentiment analysis with key phrase extraction and some other things to get a good picture of the activity on your message boards, support portals, things like that. Finally, translator text. You see what it does. It's not that hard to build. And my favorite story to kind of wrap this up is I know somebody that works at a company local here to me. They were localizing their software into Spanish, had no native Spanish speakers. And so instead of farming this out to a translation place, we're using the Translator API that I had actually offered to write for them for free because I thought it would be an interesting case study. They paid 3 of their employees to take 6 months of Spanish to localize the software and translate all of the dialogues and text boxes and all that. You're no farther ahead when you do that. Somebody's new to the language anyway. You're going to have to run it by somebody that is an expert to make sure you haven't made dialect mistakes and things like that. Translator text does all the heavy lifting for you. And then you could just turn it over to somebody and say, listen, we fed this to the Translator API. Please make sure it hasn't made a mistake or said something that's not appropriate. And then you're done. And you didn't have to send 3 people to Spanish lessons for 6 months in the middle of a pandemic when we're not really supposed to be going there. So that's that. Thanks for spending an hour with me. I love talking about this stuff. Hopefully that comes through over this. These are all the ways to find me. Like I said, reach out with feedback. If you liked it, if you didn't like it, if you're any of it helps. And or if you just want to talk racing or data or anything. Thanks for letting me be there. It was crushing to me that I didn't get to go to this Saturday in May, but hopefully when this is all over, I will be able to make that trip. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Matt. Lior says, many cognitive services available in containers, very useful for many use cases like Luis and text analytics.
Yes, yeah, I don't even touch on that in here, but from an infrastructure standpoint, you know, having the call home to the cloud all the time was kind of a deal breaker for, I mean, you know, we can play with it like this, but some companies weren't really comfortable with that. So much of this is containerized now that it only calls home for billing. So you're not, that data is not going anywhere else. It just calls home and says, I made this many calls. How much does it cost? That deserves its own session too. Containerization of this is very, very cool.
Cool. Can you see the chat, Matt?
Let me, it doesn't want to show me the chat. If I kill my screen share, I can.
No, it's okay. Just some people say thank you.
Okay.
Any questions, anyone? You can open your mics if you prefer to. I see some people writing.
I can say on my behalf, that's your. Thank you very much, Matt. I'm familiar with cognitive services. I'm doing my own sessions on cognitive services, and it's always nice to hear about it. Like every time, I think it's a very useful tool. This is a very like there are a lot of implementation that can be done with cognitive services, like lots of them. And it can save a lot of money and effort, especially on those stages of development of a new application or thinking about something new that you want to go with, like a startup. And instead of investing in a team of AI and engineers and training on data, you have something that is available that if it grows, the service will grow with you. But if you want to throw it away, it won't cost you any penny.
Yeah, there's when I do a longer version of this, there's a story I tell. So I mentioned doing the thing for the soccer podcast. That actually put me together with somebody else here. We started a company that was really soccer scouting and analytics and things like that, but there was a sentiment analysis element to it. The company was just the two of us. We never had an office. We did everything in the cloud. But yeah, we were doing social media sentiment monitoring for them based on roster moves and things like that. It was really, really interesting. It's not, unfortunately, I'm not allowed to show a lot of it, but it was for a top flight club here, and really, really cool stuff. And yeah, I mean, we created a company in, you know, a few days.
Exactly. Thank you.
Cool, thanks. Well, I think
All right.
That's it.
Thank
Thank you
you
very much, Matt. Thank you again.
Thank you so much.
For the rest of you, our next meetup is on Sunday about Power BI, so see you there. Bye.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Matt.